that is looking at defining success. So that first stage in the actual workshop process, when you've got people together and you're trying to help them to think about what will good look like for us. Caroline, over to you. Oh, sorry, I do need to share my screen, don't I? I'll do that just now.
Hold on. Okay, Jamie, is that the right version of my screen that you can see?
Yep, all looking great.
Okay, good. Hello everyone. I'm sorry that I can't see you all, but I'm quite pleased that you can't see me, so that's good. So this evening, I'm going to, or this morning, wherever you are, I'm going to talk about defining success. So this is about agreeing what successful conservational recovery looks like in this particular case, and also to establish how we'll know when we get there. So it's pretty crucial, and so we're going to spend a little bit of time on it. Now, by the time we get to this piece in a workshop, we will have listened to a series of presentations covering things like the biology, history and status of the species, the main threats impacting its viability or recovery, and successes or failures of conservation action to date. And we may also have heard talks on other things, just to really set the scene, to get people thinking about the issues that we're going to be dealing with during the rest of the workshop, and to bring everyone to the same place. And we'll also have heard participants introduce themselves, so we'll start to have a sense of some of the things that they care most about. But then before moving on to the next piece, which is identifying the issues or obstacles standing in the way of success, it is really useful to spend some time discussing what success means to the stakeholders in the room. And really being clear about what our definition of success is helps us to make sure that we're all working to a common purpose right from the beginning, and also to make sure that when we're thinking about the obstacles to achieving success, we really do a thorough job of identifying the issues to all of the things that we care about as a group. Now, for some species, in some situations, it's not a very challenging job to think about what we want to achieve. So for species that are really at immediate risk of extinction, so in very small numbers, very limited range, elusive threats are still present in the environment, what our work is going to be all about preventing extinction. So we don't need to overthink it. We don't need to think any further than that. There'll be time later on, if we're successful in preventing extinction, for thinking about what recovery and long-term conservation might look like for the species. But for other species, it's not as clear-cut. And so this is an example of a North African antelope, the Scimitar horned oryx, which once roamed in large numbers across Africa. Numbers were depressed by various types of threat, and it was extinct in the wild by the late 1980s. But there was a large and well-managed captive population of several thousand animals. There were animals in large fenced reserves in some of the more remote edges of the former range of the species. So extinction was prevented. Extinction wasn't really an issue, but clearly the species was not in a state that most of us would think of as well conserved. So when we have situations like that, we need to start to think, well, what would be enough conservation? And this is another example. So Marla is a desert marsupial that was once widespread and of cultural importance to Australian Indigenous communities. The population collapsed in the 1900s. It was driven to extinction in 1992. But by 2003, there was really quite a large enclosure within its former range, had a reasonable number of animals in it, around 200, and the likelihood of extinction had gone down significantly. But still, is that enough conservation? And I think that most of us would consider that not to be enough conservation, even though we have essentially prevented extinction, at least for the foreseeable future. And there are many species that we think of as being highly endangered, but that still exist in the tens of thousands of individuals. And if we decided tomorrow that we were able to adequately protect a network of existing reserves in which they occur in viable numbers within their natural range, we probably could avert extinction, and the species would probably persist for a very long time. But what we would see is a gradual erosion of the species range. We would see it contract to those protected areas. We would see thousands of animals still lost, and we would see the species disappear from large areas of its former range. So it's important to think about how much conservation is enough. What is the potential conservation landscape for a species? You know, how much could it recover? How much space is there for it now? What kinds of places do we think it should exist? So once we get beyond thinking about fighting extinction, we can start to think about what recovery would look like. We can think about whether species need ongoing conservation management, and if we're really lucky, in some cases we might be able to move a species onto a situation in which it requires little or no conservation management. So we can think of this as kind of a phased process, but there is no one definition of what saving a species looks like, or of what a saved species looks like. And so ideas about what the ideal future looks like for a species can be highly subjective, and that can make it difficult to plan in a coherent way, because different people involved in the planning process may have a different picture in their head of what success looks like. So it's important that we spend some time on this piece. So does that make sense so far? Any questions so far, Jamie?
There aren't any questions that I'm seeing here. One thing that I think is worth, you picked up on it, and it's worth just clarifying in terms of process. That you've had that. This is coming after you've got a welcoming ceremony. You might have dignitaries doing initial presentations. Welcome to my country, and isn't this wonderful that this is happening? You've got those core presentations about what we know, what we think we currently know about the species. And now, as you said, we're starting to move into this working group session and thinking about the stretch in what success might look like. But there aren't any questions, so I'll stop rambling and let you ramble instead.
Thank you. Okay, so when we think about defining success, we often look at this in two ways. One way is aspirationally, so trying to think about kind of our dreams for the species, if you like, but the other way is bringing that right back down and thinking about practical things that we are aiming at. So we're gonna cover both of those things, and we're going to start with looking aspirationally at what we would like to achieve for a species. And we often do this in the form of a vision statement, and we work with the stakeholders in the room to develop an aspirational definition of success. So we ask people essentially to paint a picture of what success would look like for them, and then we use those things to build a definition of success that everyone can get excited about. So we want our aspirational statement to be set in the future, because that can really help to lift people out of their current operational difficulties and the things that are really stopping them from moving forward. We want our aspirational statement to be bold and inspiring, so that people really get excited about spending the next 3 days working towards it. But we don't want it to be science fiction. We don't want people to be unable to suspend disbelief as they work on this vision. So we want it to be something that is within the bounds of what might be considered achievable, but a stretch. You know, we want to stretch ourselves and do the best that we can for a species. And so these are some examples of previously constructed vision statements. And I'm not going to read them all out, but I think that these materials will be available to you if you want to go and look at them later. And if you do, you'll see that there are similarities. There are some themes that are incorporated in here. And there's a reason for that I'll come back to later. But I'm just going to point to one of them here. So this scimitar horned oryx vision says that our vision is for viable, secure, free-ranging populations of scimitar horned oryx, moving through a regional mosaic of interconnected areas, both strictly protected and for multiple use, distributed within ancestral range, in harmony with local people, restoring pride, cultural and natural heritage, economic and ecosystem value. So we can see here that there are all sorts of themes embedded in this. We can see that that this is a species for which landscape changes or land use changes have happened within its previous range, which mean that if it's put back there, it can't necessarily live the life that it once did, and it will have to carve out a new way of coexisting with graziers and other people using the land. And that's recognised in this vision. So people are not being unrealistic about that. They're accepting that the species will be moving across lands that are both strictly protected, but also those that are used by other people for other purposes. People clearly want to see it back within its ancestral range, but you can also see that it's important to the people involved in this project that the species remains within the psyche of the indigenous people of that area, and continues to be a part of their folklore and important to them and valued by them. So once we've thought about our aspirational statement, we need to think about bringing that. Yes. Yes.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I should have just before you were inhaling. No, I should have asked. But there's a couple of points just about those vision statements you had up there. Then about these are quite wordy sort of vision statements, and is that normal? Is that good, or should they be tighter, or is there a reason why they're not all trying to be fitted into a sentence?
Yeah, that's a good point actually, and I should have mentioned that. These vision statements are very wordy, and it does. These vision statements can be one sentence long. What constitutes a good vision statement, really, in this context, is a vision statement that does paint a reasonable picture of an improved situation for the species that everyone in the room is happy and comfortable and pleased with. That's essentially the definition. If the grammar is all over the place, if it has all sorts of words that are misspelled, if it has some very odd concepts in it, as long as they're not to the detriment of conservation, I think it's not necessarily inappropriate. The important thing is that you have something that you can work with, that everyone can get behind, because this is really a vehicle for the next planning steps. So I have seen vision statements that are shorter than this. I haven't seen many that are much shorter than the Hornbill one. But I think that, as any of you would understand who have worked with groups of people, as soon as you start asking people to agree on a piece of writing, it tends to blow out. And so a number of these have sentences and pieces of sentences in them that probably could be stripped out. But it was important to somebody at the time in the workshop, and nobody else minded, so it stayed in.
Thank you for that.
Okay. Okay, so now that we have our big wordy and in some cases quite difficult to get your hands around vision statement, We want to translate this into operational terms so that we can see what it actually practically means for people working on the ground. So operationalizing the vision is about explaining the operational intent behind some of the terms and phrases used. And sometimes there was no operational intent, so we have to discuss it and decide whether what that means to the group. We really want to connect the vision to the more practical elements of the plan, and this will be the first step in that. And we do want to agree what and how much needs to be achieved. So some of these things are they're quite long-term things. They're quite big and ambitious things, but it's not clear how much we need to do in order to get across the line of what we consider to be success. And we do want to think about how we might measure progress towards the vision. So if we come back to the Scimitar Horned vision, we have these viable, secure, free-ranging populations, etc., etc. But when we start to drill down into this, we need a better understanding of what we mean by viable. So what do we mean by viable? How are we defining ancestral range? That's not always obvious. What does in harmony with local people really mean in practical terms? And what's our starting point or baseline for each of these? So where are we now with each of these, and what kinds of things might we be able to measure to track our progress over time towards this vision? So there's an example here, and I'm only going to talk briefly about this because it's quite wordy, but I think you can come back to it and take it apart in more detail if you want to. So this is a very wordy 50-year vision for Marla, but the reason that I like it as an example is because people spent a lot of time defining it operationally. So you can see on the left-hand side is the vision, on the right-hand side are the operational definitions of that vision, really. And what I've done in this next slide is to identify the items within the vision, and then I've reflected them in the same colour on the right-hand side to show you how those things connect. So, for example, if we look at the pale blue writing, we look at secure and resilient marla populations. You know, what do we mean by secure and resilient marla populations? How many marla would be considered secure? What kind of security do they need to be living under? Do the places where they live need to be predator-free? You know, what do we mean by those two terms? And this was discussed a lot by the group, and they decided that having 3 sites that were geographically separated to manage risk would be part of security and resilience. Having each of those 3 enclosures carry around 1,500 marla or more would be required for security and resilience, and maintaining an expected 50-year extinction risk at 0 would also be what was required. And these things, although we're not going to deal with that today, these are the kinds of numbers and thresholds that we can get to using population viability analysis modelling, which is one of CPSG's standard tools. And I know that you're going to cover that in week 4, so this kind of thing will make more sense to you then. Also, we talked here about Australians being aware of marla and acknowledging their cultural and ecological values, and people threw that around quite a lot, and in the end decided that really there needed to be some marlas in the cities, in the major zoos, telling the story of marla recovery. So that became the indicator for that piece of the vision. So you can see how these things that are very lofty and aspirational through this process can get nailed down quite firmly to something that is measurable and practical. Any questions?
No questions yet. I think people are following fine, Caroline. Yeah, and one of the things that sort of strikes me about the way you've sort of described that visioning process is that you're moving the vision from something that could be quite generic to something that's very much tailored around that particular species and that particular group of stakeholders and what they really think of what good looks like. So that process of, it doesn't have to be putting numbers on it, but that process of clarifying in a bit more depth, what does that look like here, it also makes it that much more powerful as something to aim for, not in the short term, but you can really see what that future desired state might look like.
Yeah, that's right, Jamie, and that is a good way of describing it. This process, there are no clear rights and wrongs about this process. It is all about determining what saving this particular species means to this particular group of people. And so there are no hard and fast rules, and different groups will have different appetites for the extent to which they want to nail things down and have exact numbers and thresholds and boundaries around all of the elements of the vision. Some groups are much more quantitative in their approach, and that's also fine as long as we can use that to set some operational directions for work. Okay, so how do we get this done in a workshop? Is the next question, and I think it's worth pointing out up front that I'm not sure that you always can get all of this done in a workshop, and I often can't get all of it done in a workshop because I think people really just have to think about things very carefully. And the other thing to think about is that this work, although we do the beginning of the visioning piece quite early on, we don't complete the vision immediately. It's something that people come back to during the workshop. It's presented several times so that people can start to get comfortable with the language. They can identify. They get several attempts to make it something that they can get behind. So the vision itself proceeds slowly throughout the workshop, and the operational definitions need to be informed by the understanding the system piece, which you'll be moving on to in the next couple of weeks, I would imagine. So I think in terms of what's realistic in a workshop, it's really important to agree the vision while everyone's together, because you could see how many words are involved in some of those vision statements. It's extremely difficult to do that productively by email afterwards. So while everyone's in the room, get closure on the vision. And agree the main themes for further definition, because once you have those main themes, they won't come as a surprise to anyone. People have had an opportunity to contribute, and people seem to be, in general, much more comfortable having a smaller group go away, even after the workshop, and hone those into something more operational. So essentially, the vision and the main themes done at the workshop. Operational definition of success, measures for success, and baselines, which we'll talk about in a minute, ideally done at the workshop, but can be done afterwards. And so I just wanted to run through 2 quick recipes for generating a vision so that you can get a sense of the kind of thing that we do. Now, I know that Jamie also has some of these things, and there are lots of different ways to do this. But I just wanted to go through a couple that are, they're fairly different in terms of the way that people experience them. So they both start out in the same kind of way, by a scene setting kind of presentation. So you would give each person in the room a paper and pen, introduce the idea of a vision and explain the value of the process. Show some examples, some simple examples, and sometimes it's nice to show examples from that particular part of the world or from similar species, but also some very different ones. It's quite good to show some long ones and some short ones so that people can see that there's not necessarily a right and wrong. And also it's quite nice to show a vision and an operational translation so that people can see that the very aspirational process is going to turn into something more concrete. Some people like to know that in advance, other people don't mind so much. Give people things to think about, and this is a set of things that Kent Redford and colleagues came up with, and you'll see those represented in many of the CPSG visions that are sitting in reports. So ask people to think about things like representation. So where do we want the species to be represented within different kinds of ecological settings? We want to make sure that the taxon's genetic diversity is represented. Think about whether multiple management systems will be a theme of the future for this species. And there are lots of species now that that probably are going to at least in part of their range be behind fences, or they're going to be only in protected areas. Some are going to be propped up by intensive management. So think about whether we're going to be mobilising multiple management systems, and think about whether that should be part of the vision, if it's likely to be a permanent feature of the future of the species. Think about avoiding irreplaceable loss, so having a number of different populations around the place. Think about the whole of species, of the species. Which other species would it normally interact with? What kind of habitats? What kinds of ecosystems? What would be a normal part of the life of that species, and can we incorporate that into the vision? And also the human socioeconomic and cultural needs and desires. So in what ways is this species important to people? And is that something that we want to make sure is promoted and valued for the future? So some things to think about. And then set the task. So this is a very simple set of task instructions. It's sometime in the future, and 25 and 50 years are often used. It can be 100 years, but 25 to 50 is often used as something that is close enough to seem realistic, but far enough away that it does allow you to take yourself out of operational challenges. So it's, say, 50 years into the future. We paint a picture that the strategies recommended at the planning workshop were implemented with success, and the species is in a very different situation. In a few sentences, describe one or more themes, characteristics, or ideas that you personally would like captured in a description of that situation. So we're asking people to paint a picture of the future. Write them down. You have 5 minutes. Don't worry about wordsmithing. So it's quite nice to give people the option of not writing complete sentences. It's quite good if people have the option just of writing ideas, themes, so that they don't feel under any pressure. And after 5 minutes, invite each person to read out what they have and stick it on a visioning wall. And then everyone can go to that visioning wall and group similar items. And then a smaller group can be given the job of crafting that statement from the submissions. The advantage of this really is that it is simple and quick, and everyone can say exactly what they think, and they can see it put on the wall, so everyone feels included in that process. So some of the disadvantages, but just in my opinion, actually, they may not seem like disadvantages to others, but it's essentially an individual exercise, so people work initially entirely on their own. It puts people on the spot. We'll often have people in workshops who are not conservation professionals or not working in conservation, and for them I think it might be more difficult to think about a vision for a future for the species, and to have them stand up and read something out might be confronting. Some people might be working in their second or third language. They might be shy and not want to stand up. So all of these things need to be taken into account if you're thinking of doing this particular exercise. But there's an alternative that I quite like, which I'm calling the interactive Chatty version. So in this one, after people have written out their initial statements or ideas or themes, they're asked to turn to the person next to them and share what they've written, and then those two people work together to combine their submissions into one. They just get 5 minutes to do that, so they're under some pressure. And then they turn around to the 2 people next to them and they repeat that exercise and produce one version for all 4 of them. And then they turn to the 4 people next to them and do the same thing. And we do that until the number of groups in the room is no more than about 6. And then one person is invited from each of the final groups to read out what that group has produced. And everybody else is asked to listen carefully and identify common themes, which we then spend a few minutes capturing and discussing. And then we assign a visioning working group to craft a vision statement and also have a first stab at some operational definitions. And I quite like this because people don't have to stand up this early on in the workshop and say things out loud. But they do start to work together with people that they don't know straight away, and to be supporting each other within a group. So it's quite a nice group exercise. There's a lot of energy, and I think that you do get really good results from this. You can do it in a bit more than an hour, but it is more complicated to manage.
Caroline, Taneka is just asking about the size of the visioning group, which is interesting because this was a question that came up yesterday as well, and it's not one I'd really thought about. But you know, you are in a workshop setting, and it's one of those points of there's a bit of divergence, but there's a point of convergence there that's quite important for everybody to be able to sign up to a potential future. So the original visioning group that's coming up, generating ideas about what the vision might look like, is everyone in the workshop in general, isn't it? Did that make sense, Caroline, or not? I think I've lost you.
Jamie, I completely lost you there, or at least I could hear you. Can you hear me?
So the visioning.
I lost you for about.
Can you hear me now?
Hold on.
Can you hear me now?
It's very yes, but it's very patchy.
Okay.
Hold on.
Can you look at the chat group? Okay, so it looks like lots of people lost me for a second. Am I back now? Can you hear me?
You are back, but can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You haven't changed for me.
Oh, you can hear me, right?
Yeah. So yes. So if I'm speaking now and I'm asking you a question, will you be able to respond?
Yes, I can respond.
Okay, it sounds very slow. So can you just, somebody's got their, yeah. I can hear Caroline, but not Jamie. Good stuff. Breaking up. Caroline, could you just look at the comments in the comments box, which is from Taneka, and maybe just respond to her, which is about the size of the working group to develop the vision.
Yes, I can. So I'm assuming that everyone can hear me. For the working group for the vision. So essentially we do this first piece for the vision with absolutely everybody in the room. So everyone contributes their ideas, everyone identifies what the main themes are, but then we ask for volunteers, and it's usually a group of 6 to 8 people who will agree to develop the vision further, and they will meet at lunchtimes, in the evenings, whenever they can find some time out of the working group sessions, and they will work on the vision. they will make sure that they have included the ideas that everybody produced to the best of their ability. But they will then bring the new drafts of the vision back to the entire workshop and present those and take comments on them at least once, and ideally twice during the workshop, so that the vision doesn't move forward without everyone's agreement. And the vision is one of the things that we will finalise on the last day before we leave. And it's not final until everybody can live with it. I hope that answers that question. We seem to have lost Jamie.
No, I'm here. And
you there?
Can you hear me okay now?
I can, but yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, that's good. I think you explained it well, and actually Jim's given a very similar answer, which shows a great deal of consistency, which is great to see. So yeah, please carry on.
Oh, good. Yes, actually, I can't see that comment. Okay, but I'll just carry on. Okay, where am I? Right. So again, how do we get this done in a workshop? How do we think about operationalizing the vision? Well, we would generally ask the working group, the visioning working group, to take a first cut at this. And the kind of thing that we might help advise them on is, the kind of advice that we might give them is to look at the vision or the draft vision, think about the themes that people have identified, and start to highlight them in the vision and think about each piece in turn. So what we have on the screen here is a worked example. So I'm going to just move through the steps involved in this. So this is an example of a Bellingham River snapping turtle conservation plan. This vision it's not too long. So the Bellingham River Snapping Turtle Project is a model conservation program for supporting critically endangered native fauna, facilitated by multi-agency collaboration and community engagement. The program has ultimately led to river health restoration and a sustainable turtle population that is disease-free. So this is a species that was hit by a novel disease pathogen a couple of years ago. No one had seen that disease before. It wiped out the entire adult population of this turtle, which only exists on a 65-kilometre stretch of river in New South Wales in Australia. And it was already under attack by a number of threats, including an introduced but native turtle. And there's been a lot of degradation of the riverside around this river. So there were threats in place originally, but the turtle was in much larger numbers and was not considered under imminent threat of extinction. But this disease thing hit, and suddenly action is urgent. So that's the situation. This is the vision that was produced. Now you can see here that we've highlighted some themes that we're going to work with here. So multi-agency collaboration was something important to people. Community engagement is important. The community has very strong views around this river about what should and shouldn't happen there. So really making sure that the community are on board is key. And also river health restoration and a sustainable turtle population were very important. And a turtle population that is disease-free is in the vision here. So if we just move to what people, the way that people thought about defining these more operationally, because they are quite difficult. We can't really aim for a turtle population that's disease-free, because that wouldn't make any sense. There aren't any populations of anything, as far as I'm aware, that are completely disease-free. So what we mean in this case is that the Bellingham River virus, this new virus, does not pose a threat to the species in the wild. So people talked about whether the river needed to be free of this virus, but actually no one minds having the virus around. It can be an endemic virus, just as long as it doesn't cause any mass die-offs of this kind. River health restoration and a sustainable turtle population. Again, we want to think about what these things mean for us. In this particular instance, to this turtle, and to the people working on this project. So in this case, what they agreed this meant for them was the species being abundant in the Bellingham River, the restoration of the species and its ecosystem being sufficient for ongoing resistance to known threats, and that this introduced turtle does not pose a threat to the species in the wild. So we can see that these things still, although they are better defined, they still need some more work before we could really know whether we'd achieved them or not. So we can't really know something like whether we've achieved abundance unless we have some sense of what abundance means, for example. So the group needed to go one step further, and this had to be done after the meeting because we just didn't have time during the meeting. So the group went further to defining targets around this so that we could actually know when we'd achieved these definitions of success. So, for example, species abundance in the river is considered to be at least 1,500 individuals by 2030. We also wanted stability of population size over time, so we don't want we don't want ongoing large fluctuations in populations. And we want strong rates of recovery when there are stochastic events. So when storms do hit and a number of turtles die, we want to see them recovering rapidly. So these are things that we can actually monitor and report on from the river that will tell us whether we're moving towards our vision. The community supporting the recovery program and being actively engaged in the long-term health of the Bellingham River system, that was in the end, the target set for that in the end was that landholder involvement is indicated by at least 15 kilometres of riverside zone rehabilitation by 2021, and the citizen science project on river health, including a minimum of 70 volunteers. So these are now very tangible targets that we've set around these broad ideas about what constitutes success. And this group was able to go a step further after the meeting and identify where we are now with each of these targets, which is really important. So we need to know where we are now in order to measure how far we have progressed. So currently we can't confirm the absence of virus in the river. There's no vaccine and no other form of protection available for the species. So that's our starting point. The introduced turtle is in the river, and there are no measures in place to control it, and there are none tested. So we're not quite sure what we're going to do about that river turtle, but we're clear about where we are. The current adult population in the river is 0, and there are about 300 juveniles present. So we have a clear steer on where we're starting from. The population has recently been unstable, and we have figures on what constitutes stability, and monitoring is in place, so we can start to look at population fluctuations and recovery after environmental events. There is a framework for discussion with landowners in place, but no citizen science project, so that's an area for further work. And all 4 agencies that were considered important in the multi-agency collaboration are currently involved actively in this project, so that's our baseline for that. Now that's quite a lot to chew over, but I'm hoping that from this you can start to see how you can proceed from a quite lofty, airy-fairy general vision statement to something which is more operational, to some actual measures that we can use to decide when we've operationally achieved the vision, and also the kinds of baselines that we might look at to understand exactly where we are now with respect to that longer term vision. Are there any questions on any of that?
I'm just tracking the chat box, and there are no particular questions coming out. I did have one about time, and if you think about this particular workshop with the turtle, how long did it take within the workshop to move from blank canvas through to the baselines that you managed to create?
Yes. So again, in this particular instance, this was a 2-day workshop. And it was a 2-day workshop that involved a relatively small number of people, actually, probably only about 20 20 people, and about half of those people were working on a disease risk analysis, while the other group was working on all the other threats to the species. So I think that we probably spent about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour on the vision statement, on developing that and discussing it, and identifying broad themes. But the rest of the work was done after the workshop. So this was a very active post-workshop discussion. So we, in fact, there was an enormous amount of discussion after the workshop around the draft, to make sure that it really was a reflection of what everyone agreed the situation was for the turtle, and also what sensible, achievable targets and definitions of success might look like. So this did take a while. This took quite a lot of toing and froing after the meeting, but actually but the discussion was all productive, and it was all amicable because people had agreed on the vision. Nobody touched the vision after the workshop. People had agreed on those main themes. So the themes themselves probably only took another half an hour. So I'd say 2 hours in total for that group to come up with the vision and that middle piece, those operational definitions, if you like. And then the targets was something that was done later, and the baselines were done later.
Yeah, so I suppose you've if you get agreement up front, and this is what we spend. I mean, I'm realizing more and more is that initial discussion around what we understand as the current situation, or what's most important here for us to focus on. If you can kind of get that agreement, then there's no reason why other more detailed work can't happen outside of the kind of the environment of a workshop. There are a couple of questions that have just come up, which I just wanted to pick up on. So Daniel is saying, did you get as a facilitator involved to ensure all key stakeholders were present at the workshop? So were you involved in that, thinking about that preparing to plan stage? Did you kind of encourage people to think about who should be there to get the right group?
Yes, well, in this I did, but in this particular workshop, the problem that initiated the workshop essentially was that there were a group of experts involved with the project who were unable to agree on what needed to happen next. Not necessarily in a conflicting or aggressive way. They just weren't all agreed on what the information that they had was telling them about what was going on in the river, and so things had stalled to some extent. So yes, we did have a discussion with the organisers about who needed to be in the room, but they already had a pretty good sense of who needed to be in the room. And this wasn't a workshop where we involved all the community representatives and stakeholders in the Bellingham community, because this was really about it was really about establishing agreement within this core sort of scientific group about what they were going to be able to tell the community at the community stakeholder meetings, because they were very keen that they all be on the same page. So this was really 2 days of flushing out a common interpretation of the data. And
I thank you for that. I just had a point that I was going to follow up with, and now I've forgotten it. So instead, I'm going to go to a much better question from Vicky, and she's saying about, okay, so you've got this bit in the workshop. So how did you then facilitate the process outside the workshop to ensure there was inclusivity if you're doing it remotely to produce these more detailed figures, etc.?
Yeah, hi Sally. So outside the workshop, I really just was like we would just send out. We had a version of the workshop report that included everything that we've discussed and all the different components. That was sent out, and I would, in different circulations of the draft report, I would point to particular sections and ask people specifically to answer particular questions about it. You know, do you agree? Does this look to you like a complete set of operational points to deliver on this vision? Are you happy with these as targets? Do you see any problems with these? Do you have any problem with these baselines? You know, is there anything that you disagree with? So actually eliciting responses from people, and also targeting some people who I knew from the workshop had strong views on certain things. So if I didn't hear from them, I would make sure that I had got a written endorsement of certain bits of the plan from them, just in case they hadn't seen it. So, but you know, it was a relatively simple process for this group, because there were only around 20 of them, and there were only around 8 of them that had very strong opinions on particular areas. So I could just go backwards and forwards to those. It would be a very different situation if it was a workshop of 60 or 70 or 80 people. It would be much harder to do this stuff out of session.
And I suppose, if you weren't able to join us last week, I'd recommend you go back and have a look at the recording for the preparing to plan bit, because in there's a section, there are lots of sections that struck home to me. It's what Caroline was talking about, but one in particular was around the initial discussion with project planners, or workshop planners who to really clarify where they are trying to get to. And so while there is a generic process one might work through, that is going to change each time, because it depends on where that group wants to get to, how many people are going to be involved, where are they up to at the moment in their planning, and so that's going to very strongly influence the process that then follows, and so how you spend your time in the workshop, what extent you can do things after the workshop. That can be helped to be shaped a bit in that preparing to plan bit, and you understand where people are trying to get to. And Sally actually just asked another question about whether you use red listing at all, the red list status at all, in trying to get more of a tangible sense over baselines, and then where you're trying to get to look at, you know, for example, moving. Could you imagine including a change in red list status as part of the visioning process?
Yeah, and that's a good point. And that would be a fairly common operational definition of success, or a fairly common measure of improved status, or, you know, improved condition of the species. Something like red list status. Although, having just looked at red list status changes post planning for 50 or 60 taxa, and seeing that actually very little change is made over quite a long period of time. I am increasingly thinking that finer scale measures might be better for that. I think it's a very big ask within a 5-10 year planning window to make progress on a red list status. But that, you know, differs between taxa, obviously. But for anything that's even vaguely long lived, that can be a tricky one. But yeah, definitely red list status is a well used one.
And actually, if your vision is 50 years or more, then you start moving into the realms of possibility, with changing of the status. And I had an interesting chat yesterday with somebody from the Green List group, and they, I think, are imagining timeframes of 100 years, and so we are starting to have much greater stretch, perhaps a bit more realistic, about how long it's going to take us to achieve the change we want to, and that's becoming more and more, it's the norm, but it's more and more common to have much longer timeframes to be imagining into the future.
Yes, that's definitely true, and certainly it's often the case that when we have population modelling included in these, which I know you'll cover in a few weeks' time, that we often look at over much longer time frames, and so a recent orangutan one was looking at over a 500-year time frame, because the modelling work has to be done in a way that's sensible for the lifetime of the species, rather than for our own planning windows and things. So that is it. So definitely, you know, 100-year windows are not at all unusual. This particular Bellingham River turtle one was a very short window, but that's because of it was essentially a New South Wales government project, and they have particular funding windows, they have particular timeframes for recovery and for grant awarding. So they have a special fund that is for work that will be carried out over a period of time. So this is a particularly short time frame. I think 50 years is the norm. 100 years is not at all unusual.
Great, thank you, Caroline. So we interrupted you enough to allow you to carry on.
No, I think that I'm almost done. Actually, hang on. I think I've got one more slide. Yeah. So this is just a summary, really, of the tips for visioning, really, and defining success. So when you're visioning, I think it's always good to encourage participants to use the present tense. So it lifts them up a narrative of what they're going to do, and imagines it all being done. I think providing the visioning group with a sheet of examples to help them, they seem to find helpful. For international groups, make sure there's good range state participation in the vision working group. It's often the case that we'll have international participants who come, you know, they come long distances to work on a project, and they're very keen, and they volunteer for everything, and it's great, and they're such an asset. But it's really important that actually the visioning process is owned and driven by people who are going to be living and working around these species for the long haul. So working a little bit harder to get volunteers from more local participants, and maybe priming some of them ahead of time to volunteer is often a good idea. Making sure, along the same lines, making sure that successive drafts that are reviewed of the vision and any other operational definitions are translated into the local languages. It does take a bit longer, but I think that we should always work very hard to make sure that people have an opportunity to communicate in the language in which they're most comfortable. Allow at least one, and ideally a couple of sessions during the workshop for reviewing and revising the visioning work. Sometimes it's not the case, but often it's the case that people are very interested in the visioning component. If time's short, prioritise getting agreement on the vision and the main themes for operational definitions, and usually that's enough to get reasonable license to go and work in a more detailed way with a smaller group outside of session, but noting that everyone who's at the workshop needs to be able to see and comment on and be comfortable with whatever comes out of that ultimately. And then I just had some general notes just that I just thought. Oh yes, sorry, I'm not going to talk about PVA, but I did just have a few extra notes. So in some situations, you might have a vision statement that is so succinct and so clear that it provides all the direction that you need. And if you do, then you don't need to overthink it and go any further. And similarly, sometimes there's no appetite for visioning. When you talk to the organisers, they might mount a sufficiently persuasive argument that the group will be able to start with operational definitions of success because they're used to doing that, and they'll have a clear idea of where to go with that. So by all means, listen to that, and if it seems sensible, go with it. In some situations, the operational definitions of success may be predefined. If you're working with some government agency recovery programs, they might have a definition of successful recovery or of success, and it will be important to factor those in. So that's a good thing to ask at the preparation stage. You know, perhaps when you do a run through the visioning task, asking people whether there are existing definitions that they need to take account of. But sometimes the visioning component is really quite pivotal, and in those instances, it might be worth having a separate, workshop even. And I know that for some very, very controversial taxa, people have taken time to have an entire visioning workshop that involves a different set of people sometimes than the more technical workshop that might come after that to look at what's going to be done about achieving the vision. We've done some visioning workshops for projects that are not species projects, they're area-based projects, and it really was, amazingly, it really was fairly easy to take up 2 days just on the visioning component and the definition of success component. And it is really good to discuss visioning as part of preparation, because it's useful to think about what kinds of things are going to be really important to people in the room to have captured in that vision. And some of the things that can come up in the visioning exercise can derail subsequent discussions. So it's good to get a heads up, because you might want to use a different process to avoid that kind of derailment. So, for example, one example of where the room might split up over a visioning exercise is in sustainable use. So recreational hunting can be an important cultural thing. You know, it's important in various parts of North America that young lads get to hunt their first bear, for example. But in other parts of the world, it's considered entirely inappropriate to hunt wildlife in that way. So if you start a visioning process where the room splits along those two lines, it can be very difficult to produce a common goal, because everything will get sucked into those discussions and disagreements. So if you're likely to have that kind of conflict coming up, it's good to think about it at the preparation phase and think about how you might approach it during the workshop, and whether a visioning thing is really going to work as the first thing that you do, given the difficulty that it might cause for you in navigating those sticky issues. And I think that might be it. Okay, so that's all I had to say. I'm sorry I have gone on a bit, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks very much, Caroline. So just, I have got a question from Asker, which I'll ask just now, but for others, if you want to, now in your attendance, in the attendee box, if you want to unmute your microphone, I can then see who would like to ask a question, and then I will just queue people up. So if you want to do that now, if you do have a question, and in the meantime, I'm just going to ask Askar's question, which is this point about the differentiation between the vision and then aims and objectives. And we know if you look at the SSC species conservation planning guidelines, which CPSG was party in creating, it talks about a sort of what presents it as reasonably sort of linear process from vision through to goals, etc., etc. And what Caroline has described, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Caroline, but you described the process within the visioning stage where you're putting much more detail around the vision, and there's some of the detail in there that you might imagine could turn out to be some sort of goal statements to aim for. But really, for the way we in general are running our workshops, and what we found is helpful in lots of situations, not always, but in lots of situations, is for the goals, or what you might call objectives, to be attached to an understanding of the system, not immediately at the visioning stage. And so what you're actually going to work on to try and achieve is linked to points in the ecological, socioeconomic system in which the species exists, where you are going to have most impact on a sort of a positive impact on the species. So the goal, sort of agreeing goals in the generic workshop process comes later on, once we have understood the system, which is something we're going to be covering next week. Caroline, I know you have, there are variations in how people do this, but would you add any clarification to that, further clarification to that summary?
No, well, I think that you've covered it really well there. The way that I tend to think of it is that when you do the understanding the system and you try to flush out all of the obstacles to making progress for a species, you tend to be very focused on threats and mitigating threats. And the defining success bit gives you an opportunity to look up out of that and think about all the things that you want to achieve. And sometimes those things match up as you start to define success operationally and set targets and things. Sometimes they end up being very similar to the targets that you'll set as you are thinking about mitigating threats, but sometimes they're not. So sometimes there are opportunities that you want to take advantage of, and they don't appear when you're thinking about trying to tackle threats. So really, I think it will, as Jamie says, it will all make much more sense as you've moved through all of these steps, and you can see how they fit together.
Jim, you had a question. Do you want to ask it just now? Great.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. For example, if there is a species is already extinct in the wild, and if we want to do the reintroduction project, but now we don't know every stakeholder have probably someone want the animal back to the wild, but someone still have some concern. So in that situation, is that appropriate to do the vision style, for example, in this lecture, to start the discussion between the stakeholders? Okay.
Wow, yeah, that is quite a complicated issue, and I don't know, I wouldn't know how to advise you without knowing more about the situation, but I think that could be a situation where you would take some additional steps before you thought about a vision, so that you could be sure that the group could be united behind a common goal. So I guess it would be an interesting exercise to begin by giving people an opportunity to identify all the concerns that they have about putting a species back in the wild, and thinking about how those concerns could be mitigated, maybe. And I think it might be sensible to do that in advance of a vision, to see whether you really can mitigate some of those concerns in a reasonable way. But yeah, that is a difficult one, and that's the kind of one where I would think that things could fall apart a bit at the visioning stage. I think you'd want to move through that quite carefully. Okay, thanks.
And I think, again, it's this sort of reiterating this point about the preparation stage, that you want to have a bit of a heads up about some of these very sticky points that could come out. Because obviously, I mean, as the visioning process can be very nurturing of a sort of unity within the group. It could also be quite destructive if what you actually find is that there is something fundamental, sort of fundamental values that are completely contrary, that people can find very difficult to move on. And so it may not be helpful to be doing that. Thanks very much for that, Jim. Did anybody else have any questions before we wrap up? I know we're 10 minutes or so over, but any last questions before we finish? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so somebody just, no, that's Caroline. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, everyone. I will send around a link to the recording, and then I'll also send just the PowerPoint on its own, so you've got a copy of that. And I've got to send around the dates and times for the webinars for the next 2 weeks. And apologies for not doing that, but I'm traveling for the next 2 weeks, and that threw out all of the time zones that I was going to be I'd organised. So I'm just getting that sorted now. So you should hear back from me today with the options for each for each of the slots for weeks 3 and 4 that will be run by Caroline and my colleague Phil Miller. And please keep comments going on the discussion thread. Do let me know if you have any issues with the course. I hope you're enjoying the materials, finding them useful. And if you've got any pointers at the moment, then please let me know. A couple of you have contacted me about the certificate of reflective practice. I'm very happy to pick that up with you individually just now, or what I'll do is I can send around emails to the group. And then we will talk about it as we move through the course around week 4 or 5. I think we'll talk a bit more about what that will look like, but we can pick up the conversation in discussion threads in advance of that as well. So have a very good week. Thank you very much, Caroline, and goodbye to everyone.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks, everyone.